we are a set of analyzers of contrapuntal voices, even if it's intuitive. We're just acting of listening, but the act of listening is the brain is following these lines. A composer's ear is something to be protected. It's a very vulnerable thing. You want training because you want to have the ear be able to hear things in a profound way, but you don't want it so aware that it cannot hear its own voice anymore.
Dr. Philip Lasser, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Likewise.
Thank you for coming across the street from Juilliard.
It was a long trip, and I'm glad there wasn't much traffic.
Juilliard's where we first met, actually.
Yes.
I took a class of yours, Contrapuntal Analysis, which was a very enlightening class. And there are a lot of things I want to talk to you about today, including Counterpoint. But would you mind, for the audience, just giving a brief kind of overview of your early musical life, your training, and what you do now and teaching at Juilliard?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll say it very briefly. I was a pianist. I started as a pianist at the age of 5. But very, very soon thereafter, I was already writing. People asked me when I started to be a composer, and I said, I don't think I ever started to be a composer. I just became one. My mother was a singer, and I used to write songs for her. I wrote my first song, which she sang in public. I was 6. So I was always interested in writing. And although I continued my piano seriously and practiced and had a view of being a pianist, and I studied with some excellent teachers, but over the years, it seemed so much that I was always gravitating, like that my lessons, I would show some of my compositions. And I remember the most seminal moment was in 1990. I wrote my piano sonata for my piano. Well, I was writing it while I was studying with Gaby Casatsu in Paris. And I was playing Ravel, Tombeau de Couperin, or I don't know what, and I was playing at my lesson. And I said, I'd like to show you my piano sonata, which I had just finished. And I played it straight through. It's 3 movements, and it's a tough piece, actually. In those days, I could play it. And I played it, and I remember her face. I turned to her, and her face was, it took on a serious, very thoughtful, disposition. And she said, "I've lost you to composition." Oh. And I said,
she recognized.
No. I said, no, I want to be a pianist. She said, "No, I want you to be a composer."
Wow.
So I always say, I don't know whether that was because she thought I wasn't a good enough pianist or that she really felt that I had something to offer in writing. So I've been writing all my life. I studied in 1979. I had the good luck of meeting Nadia Boulanger very briefly. She was very ill, but I got a glimpse of that pedagogy, which is a very unique sonority-based idea of understanding of music. Harmony was paramount, spacing, doubling of chords, and thinking of how that affects how we hear music. And then since she passed away, I studied with disciples of hers. And so I always like to say my main teacher was Narcís Bonet, who was a Catalan composer who he himself had been one of her disciples. And I studied with him for many years. And there it was a mentorship relationship between me and him. In fact, I remember getting up after 2.5-hour lesson or 3-hour lesson and saying, "Monsieur Bonnet, you have a life. I should really leave now," because he was so giving of his time. And so we went through analysis of Bach and, again, all the harmony exercises and counterpoint exercises and analysis of Brahms, of Bach, and so on. Fauré, Debussy. It was endless as far as what the repertoire was. And all along, I would show him works of mine. And he had such a sensitive understanding of let's say, the awesome task of a teacher, not to influence, but to guide. And so I always say this, I think I'm lucky, I'm incredibly lucky that I had really good teachers early and didn't get forced into doing things that I didn't want to do, or be forced into a particular style, or tell me that I can't do this, as I've seen other teachers do. And so I was lucky in the sense to be able to explore my own language and to push deeper and deeper into that language. So I'm going on a sidetrack here. So at any rate, I've As I said, I feel like he was my main teacher, but I mean, on academic sides, I went to Harvard as an undergrad because there was another disciple of Nadia Boulanger who was there and I wanted to study with her, and I did. And then I went to Columbia for my master's. That was not really a great place for me as far as what I was writing musically and what they were doing or what they were interested in. I was definitely a fish out of water there. But I met Jacques-Louis Monod, who was an amazing theorist and thoughtful composer as well. And although on the opposite world from Nadia Boulanger, I mean, he was a complete serialist and he was entirely into Schoenberg. So I had these two big mentors, Monsieur Bonnet and Jacques Monod, on opposite poles. And yet in a curious way, I derived a lot of my ideas from both of them. And I wouldn't have been able to get my ideas without one or the other. I needed both in a way. So I was lucky from that point of view.
Having opposite ends of the spectrum, I guess you could kind of find your own middle ground between the two.
I think so. Yeah, exactly.
Fontainebleau and Nadia Boulanger and the Boulanger tradition have such a reputation for, I mean, she has so many famous students and has shaped the 20th century of music. Recently, I've been playing a lot of Piazzolla with this Latin American album. And there's an interesting story there too, where I think he studied with her for a while. And eventually she, kind of like maybe one of your earlier teachers, recognized what it was that he was about, or what his talent was, and said, you really should go and write tangos or something to that effect.
Yes.
So having that wisdom to guide a student or a protege into what truly suits them the most is, I think, an incredibly valuable skill beyond just the rigors of learning, 101 skill. But I'm curious, having gone through that school, what is, composition 101? What is that? Because it's a very rigorous training, and you mentioned a little bit before to me.
Right.
What would one expect from a training like that?
Well, if you're speaking specifically about Nadia Boulanger's pedagogy, it was a very, very rigorous training that she required of her students. So there was harmony. I didn't undergo this with her. As I said, I saw what she was about, and then I did it with Monsieur Bonnet. But it was 3 to 4 years of triadic harmony. People think, if those who know music assume that triadic harmony is simple and chromatic harmony in 7th chords and 9th chords is complicated. But the reality is that it's the opposite. And so she taught it from the perspective that triads and understanding spacing and doubling in a triad is so much more important and revealing for the later stuff, the stuff of chromaticism, the concept of complex chords, 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords, and so on, that they actually are just, in fact, derived from triads. So if you really want to understand the language of music, you have to understand the triad. And it's a really simple idea, a beautiful one. Basically, it's a triad is made of three notes, but harmony is a 4-voice concept. So already you have this amazing idea of, well, what note do you double? Because if you have 3 and you have to have 4 voices, you're going to double one of those notes. And there comes the whole study, which from her perspective was really adamantly, you must understand the standards before you can go and explore beyond those standards. She was adamant about this. I say she as if I know her, and I kind of know her through Mr. Bonnet, because I got that training from him, and he got it for, he studied with her for 9 years as a student, and then stayed on as her let's say, acolyte, teaching and doing a lot of the other work that she didn't do. So, and the triadic study was almost 2 years on root position. And
wow, that's a long time for basic.
Exactly. Yeah. 2 years on root position, 2 years on first inversion. First inversion is the world opens up for you as a student when you understand that you put the triad in first inversion, where the root is not on the bottom but on the top. And all the standards with regard to doublings, spacing, are endlessly sophisticated, and we would go through exercise after exercise in both melodies and harmonies. So that harmony training was rigorous. Then the second inversion, and I say this again for those who are cognoscenti and who know, in theory class, people think of there are root position, first inversion, and second inversion. And the reality is that second inversion chords don't exist. They lace or they connect between root positions and first inversions. That in the language of tonal music, there really is only root position and first inversion. And it's even more beautiful if you simplify it to the point where, from the perspective of the standard, in root position, the root is on the bottom, hence the bass. In first inversion, the root is on the top, hence the soprano. So the dialogue between where that center core of gravitational pull of the triad is either on the bottom or the top, and that's all it is. Anything else is a doubling. So if it's in the alto or the tenor, it's a doubling.
Interesting.
So as a result, 6/4 chords, which has neither the root in the bottom or the top, don't exist. And in fact, they act as the glue between root position and first inversion. And understanding that already makes you understand it's a little bit like saying, if you can have a 3-letter word like man, M-A-N, spells a word which we know and we understand and we can talk about and write about. But N-M-A is a rotation of those same 3 letters, but isn't a word in English. And as a result is not transmitting of any information. And understanding that and morphing that to harmony is understanding that you have words, and those words have syntactical meaning, and they are complexified further by doublings, obviously, and spacing. But that study was rigorous. So by 4 years, I had done root position and first inversion. And you would think, oh my God, But then within 2 months, I did 6/4, the second inversion chords.
So it moves a little more quickly further along.
And then the seventh chords, 1 year.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, this, in a sense, it's kind of like you're outlining, at least from what you were just describing, this kind of rules or music and harmony and counterpoint, it seems, follow a certain set of rules, which can be bent or broken. And maybe there's extended. And I want to ask you more about that, but it sounds like from this training, you're learning sort of these, where is the end of the room as far as, this musical space that you can inhabit in composition.
Yes. I would like to suggest what it does when you do it is it allows your ear to be incredibly attuned to the potential sound that you as a composer are going to do. It allows your ear to fine tune the potential directions of voicing and spacing and understanding. And so I feel also incredibly lucky that because I had it, my ear can hear the potential in any vertical, no matter how dissonant, how complex. I hear it, I can see it, I can imagine it going. And that is the act of a composer. So I'm not really bending the rules, I'm extending the rules and being able to use what I heard in the training of the standards, like C spot run. You need to say C spot run so you can say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Everything that is involved in shall I compare thee to a summer's day is laced in on a syntactically correct sentence,
Interesting.
But it's so much more complex. And that, I think, is equivalent in music. Knowing the rules, and not just knowing the rules, but hearing the rules and being able to perfect that fine tuning of the effect of, if I double this note, and that's just like training for the ear, like going to a spa for the ear.
So we first met in one of your classes, Contrapuntal Analysis, and I know you have another class which is Advanced Counterpoint. Is that correct?
Well, I have Advanced Counterpoint. I also do Advanced Harmony.
Harmony. Yeah. So you have a whole litany of possible materials that young musicians can study and learn from and gain the skills that you're talking about. In the class that I took from you, I remember vividly the way that you approach counterpoint, the sort of philosophy or the perspective that you brought to it was unique for me in that it wasn't just about doing first, second, third, fourth species. And I'd had a lot of that actually in undergrad, where we went through all the species and did exercises, for years I did that. But it wasn't until your class that I started to hear music in a different way based off of the material you were presenting. And a lot of it, I think, came down to some of the terminology. But I want to ask you about your approach your philosophy in Counterpoint, because you have a book you've written, The Spiraling Tapestry, or kind of a treatise on counterpoint. And I'm curious to know what inspired that, what led you to the point where you thought, I need to write a book on this. I need to write material with your own terminology and understanding of that.
Well, first of all, thank you for saying these things. It means a lot to me when I hear a musician who actually feels that the things I speak about affect them in a positive way as far as interpretation or understanding of music. So it's very gratifying.
Well, it's very true. So
thank you. Well, I mean, so The Spiraling Tapestry was written as a result of realizing that people were copying my ideas more and more. And although I find that very flattering, I did want to establish who had put these on the map. And I saw increasingly a lot of people who were saying contrapuntal voice, contrapuntal motive, and writing papers. And it's not citing where they had gotten that, and they had gotten it in my classes.
Interesting.
So it was partly a byproduct of sort of putting down, establishing once and for all that, well, these were my ideas. And then on a more positive, less egotistical reason was I wanted to lay it down clearly so that somebody who wouldn't have necessarily studied with me would be able to get these tools and hopefully apply them in their own way through a book. So I set out to write the treatise because I figured that you needed to really go from ground zero and specify these very, very simple tools that are natural phenomena in the way our Western scale is built. And I don't think it's universal, but it is definitely Western, that would allow you then to use those simple tools and hopefully creatively apply them to whatever piece you were studying or playing or even composing.
Interesting. And those terms that you are referring to, I mean, contrapuntal voice, some that linger in my mind are ghost voices, hanging tones, hanging notes. And I remember when I first encountered that idea and those concepts, when you presented them, I started noticing them everywhere when I was practicing, and especially in Bach, but in other pieces. I think in Bach, it's more obvious for a solo instrument because it's an unaccompanied suite. So you're sort of accompanying yourself in the sense that you're producing all of the ghost voices and the hanging notes that you then come back to and resolve. But I started noticing it everywhere. And I'm curious, actually, if you wouldn't mind describing what is a contrapuntal voice.
All right.
What is a contrapuntal ghost voice? Just so that people who maybe aren't as down the road in their musical terminology know what it is we're talking about. Well,
simply, very simply, contrapuntal voice, notes in the ear can only connect by step. And that comes from the Greeks. It comes from even before that as voice. Right, music sort of began with the voice before there was technology for strings and so on. So it began in singing, and singing, the most natural thing to do is to sing do, re, mi, fa, sol. And so then taking that just one step further, if you leap an interval, anything larger than a second, major or minor second, a diatonic second, you end up, in effect, leaving that one pitch to another one. It's not an interval you're traveling. You're leaving one contrapuntal voice and going to another one. And so seeing it that way, a melody, a single line melody, is actually already a counterpoint of multiple contrapuntal voices. And I say that the beautiful Gregorian chant, this is where you see that I feel that my theory is kind of showing that it evolved out of very, very early music. We call Gregorian music monophonic because it's sung, it's one line, it's either sung by one person or it's a group of people singing the same thing. But the point is it's monophonic. And yet my argument is, no, it's not monophonic. It is incredibly contrapuntal. And they themselves, the monks, whoever wrote these melodies, because they were written, they folk or otherwise derived, but they were eventually sung and composed, that is, they were using the tools at their disposal a single line could create enormous complexity by leaping, by going from one voice to another, filling in, leaving a note hanging. So a hanging pitch, as a definition, is a pitch that is dissonant to whatever tertian or triadic structure there may be, because a triad is a given. It's like a word, again, in language. When you do C-E-G or Do Mi Sol for the solfeggers, that is a unit. It's a brick. It's made up of actually 3 contrapuntal voices already, because they're all separated by a third. So you can fill in, you can go E, D, C, C, D, E, you can see C, G, A. The C is still there. The G went to A, and then you can come back to C, and so on. So hanging voices are very powerful because they're dissonant often. Not often, they always are dissonant, to whatever tertian or triadic sonority there is. And so they create tension in the ear. Bach was the master. In fact, I think Bach kind of codified this whole thing in a tonal way, so that you can have enormously beautiful lines. And even when you arrive at some moment of end, of rest, whether it's a phrase end or whatever, there's something in the back of the mind. And I always insist that it's not that you hear it or sing it or whatever, but your brain is following those contrapuntal voices one after another. I almost feel like we are a set of analyzers of contrapuntal voices, even if it's intuitive. We're just acting of listening, but the act of listening is the brain is following these lines. And so it produces long-range responsibility. And all of a sudden you can have a pitch that hangs for 10 measures. And then when you get to it, when you get back to it or move it by a step, there's something that clicks in the brain. There's something pleasurable about it because it made a connection to the past. And I think that I wax deeply philosophical very quickly. I'm sure you know.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
I feel like music is a metaphor for our human condition. We are temporal beings. We are born, we live, we have this past, present, future thing, and eventually we will pass. And that mortality idea creates the sense of time and creates this inner understanding or pleasure in going back to the past and remembering something. So a hanging pitch is essentially remembering something from the past and moving it forward. And there's nothing more beautiful than that. It's almost like symbols in literature.
It's very interesting. And that idea, it had never occurred to me until that class. I mean, obviously I was aware of dissonance. You have to resolve dissonance, but they're hanging pitches from at least from my understanding in many ways, often have to do with a note that is dissonant in a particular octave, but that may be resolved in a different octave, but that's not a true resolution.
Correct.
And it has to be resolved in the correct octave for it to actually be an authentic resolution. And so that dissonance, whether it can be 3 notes or 3 minutes or longer, is what gives us that power.
Exactly.
Emotionally.
So one of the differences, again, for those of your audience who are cognoscenti and who know of Schenkerian analysis, Schenker's analysis is a brilliant one, and I think a lot of my ideas are very similar to his, so that is fine. But one of the things that he talks about is octave transfer, which is that a note that is dissonant in an upper register, for example, he will show it as, well, it resolves in another octave, and that the notes do that in a piece like Bach. But my analysis is really focused on register. So if that note does not resolve in that register, it did not resolve, even if it resolves in a lower register. And that allows in much more complexity to happen. It allows, if I may just continue, it allows Bach, for example, to bring up the ultimate statement on form. My view of form is very simple for music. Form is cyclic. Repetition is essential for form. We have something called memory, and memory recognizes things. And when we recognize something, a structure has been built. That's the basis of all our forms. So sonata form, rounded binary form, fugue form, variation, the theme and variation form are all predicated on the same concept of cyclic repetition. Something comes back. So when we get to the recapitulation in a sonata, there's only one reason why we know we're at the recapitulation, even if we're not theorists, and that's because we recognize the theme again. So whether we do that or not is essential for repetition is essential for structures. So then the other statement about it is that form, for me, in music is a temporal thing. So as a result, is cyclic. So when you start a piece, you are actually traveling along a big circle, sometimes 40 minutes. But when you're at the end of that circle or the end of the piece, you're actually at 11:59 on the clock.
Interesting.
Which means that the composers have carefully designed a mechanism so that we're traveling from a beginning back to a beginning. And so one of the key ways to do that, certainly that Bach codified, and I think all the others later copied, was to hang a pitch at the end of a movement or at the end of a piece that cyclically remembers and can only be resolved by remembering the beginning.
I think you use an example of one of his chaconnes that does that in the spiraling tapestry, which is a very beautiful example of how that happens. And I happen to agree. I mean, I agree largely about, the more that I pay attention to, especially Bach's writing, but also other composers, that resolving in a particular octave, the octave transfer, it makes a lot more sense. Not that, I'm not trying to throw any shade on Schenker, but I'm curious to know, more about how the human brain works with music. And eventually it'd be nice to, there've probably been biologists, psychologists who've gone and studied why it is that arrival back to a certain chord or a certain note or a certain theme gives us that memory or that feeling emotionally. Someone described to me once a summation of maybe a Schenkerian analysis, which is that music is a search for tonic. I don't know how much that may be an oversimplification, but the idea of once you depart from the tonic, it's all a search for the tonic again. If you wouldn't mind, I actually have a little keyboard here, and I don't know if you would mind demonstrating a few of these ideas. I know it's hard to do without a piano, but I have a little basic keyboard here, and
wow,
I thought it might be interesting to pick a tune like Somewhere Over the Rainbow and just outline how it is that that's not just one voice; it's multiple contrapuntal voices.
Okay,
and you don't have to sing.
I mean, it's Harold Arlen, I believe, who wrote it. It's already beautiful that he does.
Yeah.
So we had two voices there because I'm going to now split them so you can really hear them.
Let's turn up the volume.
So that's a third. They collapse together. So we're left with three voices.
Interesting.
I'm going to play the tune. I'll ruin the tune. Right? The octave is what's so beautiful because it creates a tonal space. And your ear does not forget this one. So that's expressive. It's now set a boundary. Oops, sorry.
I see.
And then, right?
New voice.
And another very simple example that I love is the famous unfinished symphony of Schubert's theme, which is. So I'm going to split the voices again. There are two voices there, so it's. That's all stepwise. And they merge.
Interesting.
I'm going to ruin the tune.
It's a lot more simple than we really realize.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, so the value of understanding contrapuntal voices is to see that he's playing, his ear, whether he knows it or whether he would term them contrapuntal voices or otherwise, he understands that the power is not to do. because that's boring. If you just have one voice, if you're just doing a scale, it rapidly gets tedious or boring. So immediately it's actually two voices. I could keep going, but I mean, I could keep talking about the fact that pitch comes back early, which it shouldn't, and that's what creates charm and so on. But it's playing on two voices.
It's so interesting, and it does shed a whole new light on melody, the concept of melody, and how even just one singer, not even with an instrument, with four strings, can create a whole series of different voices as one person.
And speaking of that, what I do is with folk tunes in my classes, I don't think I did it in the contrapuntal analysis class, but in my other classes, we take a folk tune, a melody, and we all sing it together, but then we break it apart into its contrapuntal voices. And I have my group sing it as a choir piece, where each group of singers is singing one of those voices. And you hear a choral piece, in a sense, from a single melody, which is why I don't believe in monophonic music. There isn't monophonic music. There is contrapuntal voice music.
Interesting. One other example, which I may ask... Thank you for bearing with this tiny little keyboard, which is not...
I think I'd have trouble playing Liszt.
I also hit 3 or 4 notes at the same time, but a piece like this that people may recognize, which is essentially all arpeggios.
Yes.
How does our mind comprehend what a contrapuntal voice is in that scenario where we just have arpeggios after arpeggio?
Right. Well, I don't think that we are actually listening this way. Almost digitally, like we're following those lines. We're hearing... and then a repeat, which, by the way, is a repetition, and then a repetition of the whole thing. And then every one of these voices moves either by step or repeat. So these went here, this one went down, this one stayed, so now we're here. This next one, the bass goes down a step. This one stays, this one goes here, this one stays. And then...
Interesting. So it really is this same exact 4-part harmony, but it's where the illusion of this arpeggio is what's making us think that it's all happening without a single voice. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it's 5 voices.
5 voices.
Right. So, I mean, I can play it as a chorale. It's...
Yeah.
And then there's a 6th voice. And I can't play the whole thing on this thing because I don't have enough registers.
There's not enough keys, yeah.
But I'm on... So that 6th voice did la, sol... And you don't go, I mean, I don't remember the number of measures, but he doesn't, that's bar 7, I guess, when he's on this G, so after La, so, and then the rest of the piece is below that pitch. So it is just hanging over some 27 measures. And then at the very end, he goes to Fa. And then the biggest issue, and this is where I see that the philosophy, I'm sure Bach would have agreed with me on this. After having waited, just to have the picture in our minds, we had a 6th voice come in after 4 measures. Here's the 6th voice. La, sol, and then, and so on. Yeah. And that sol has not touched until the 33rd measure, I guess. And that's when fa, sol, la, sol, fa. And then the final conundrum. So here's the second to last measure. Bach should do me.
Oh.
But he doesn't. Instead he does fa.
It's hanging. Okay.
And that's cyclic closure because fa, mi.
I see.
And that last measure is what I call a placeholder. We're mere mortals. But in fact, we've traveled along a big circle of 34 measures back to the beginning. And he obviously, we can't keep repeating it forever. So he puts a placeholder measure chord, which ends the piece. And I put that in quotes because actually the true end of the piece is remembering the memory of the first measure.
Interesting. That is fascinating. And the fact that this is not the only example.
No.
is there are many examples, I'm sure, is a testament to how effective it was as a tool and why on at least on one level or on one for one concept his music is so great.
People talk about, who would you want to meet in the afterlife, and I say I only believe in the afterlife because I want to meet two people.
Okay.
Bach and Schumann.
Okay.
I don't think I want to meet anybody else. In music, I don't want to meet Brahms. I love Brahms, but I don't think I'd have much to ask him. I think I kind of understand music, but there's so many little things. Like I would love to know, I would want to ask Bach, did you hang that F for cyclic closure? Am I dreaming it or did you do that?
Yeah, to verify the theory. I think that it's arguably already verified. I could see him easily saying yes. And I think maybe it might have been you who mentioned this in a class once, but I was in some class, it was either harmonic analysis or contrapuntal analysis. And someone asked about, where was Mozart aware of all this harmonic rules? Did he know he was writing in inversions and then was, a French augmented sixth chord and all this stuff? And, whether it was you or whoever it was, replied and said, well, you look at all these examples and you look at how beautifully he includes this. Basically, he went on for a minute or two, kind of spelling out what to him seemed obvious. He said, so I think it's safe to say he knew a thing or two about harmony, But I don't know, maybe not everyone shares that
like me,
point of view. It could have been you.
So the point is that you don't have to. Yeah. Training is going to allow you to do things automatically. And make choices that are good choices based, again, on the training and on the ability to hear. Anyway.
And why Schumann? I'm curious.
Well, because, so I do feel that my ideas in composition and counterpoint and all these ideas really work well when I want to understand a work of Beethoven, a work of Brahms, Bach, obviously, because I think they came from him. But Schumann, I can't crack. I love him, but I can't crack him. I can't understand why that works. And I love not knowing it, obviously, because it shows that there are limits. And I think it's because partly he was not working with a full deck, so to speak. So he was speaking in a world that was way out of the realm of causality. And since a lot of music and a lot of composers were very heavily into this concept of you do this because of something, so causal. This the very, let's say, self-conscious, like Brahms. My goodness, couldn't do anything without saying, well, that because of this and this because of that. I always put the German accent for them, but and the big beard. It's very rational.
Okay.
And Schumann is completely irrational. So he's like, just like wormholes in the universe, that all of a sudden a wormhole allows you to go to another galaxy because you're folding time. Like, whoa, that's a mind-bending idea. Yeah. So likewise, I think he's just not a rational guy. So the connections are there. There's something there. Yeah. But you can't find it rationally. Interesting.
So counterpoint, just summing up this idea of counterpoint, it sounds like an intimidating term for, say, non-musicians, but what would you simply put the difference between counterpoint and harmony? Would you say is counterpoint the analysis of individual contrapuntal voices? And how could people listen to music differently knowing what counterpoint is?
Well, I think
perhaps
anyone, if they're paying attention, the easiest thing to do is pay attention to the highest register of works, pitches that are high.
Okay.
Because they're easy to pick out, they're noticeable, and so on. And try to listen to them and remember how they sounded. And when you get back into that register, whether they moved, whether they were repeated, whether they went up, went down, I think anyone can train the ear to do that. And that's already a satisfying feeling. First of all, I'm convinced that the reason why we love the music that we love is because our ear is doing that anyway. But if you want to be conscious of it, meaning if you want to kind of understand what the mechanism underlying it, to just notice high pitch, low pitch, would already be a very, very good training for both musicians who are performers and listeners. I think it's something you can do and pay attention to. From a practical point of view, you asked the difference between counterpoint and harmony. So, I mean, if you take the traditional definitions of these things, counterpoint are studies of elegant lines, point counterpoint. So two lines working against one another according to some set simple basic rules. You don't want to do, and then, people say, well, why not? No parallel fifths. Because counterpoint, as we know, it came around about the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, and you didn't want to sound like daddy, right? Nobody wants to sound like mommy or daddy, right? You want to do your own thing as a child. So if you didn't want to sound like your grandfather or your father, you didn't do parallel fifths because that's what you did in the Middle Ages.
I see.
So in a way, it was the reason why we don't allow it is because it just sounds old-fashioned. It sounds like Gregorian or medieval music. So the independence of voice came about as a reaction to the sort of excessive parallelism of the past.
Interesting.
So counterpoint became a study of, let's say, juncture of how two lines will work together in elegance according to very simple rules. No parallel fifths, no parallel octaves. You can't leap to a dissonance. And that's about it, actually. And then you try to talk about aesthetics and what makes a good line, what makes a line hover. But in my training of counterpoint, which is different than the sort of textbook versions.
Would that be like Gradus ad Parnassum?
Yeah, that's his, right. Gradus ad Parnassum would be the traditional Fuchs, traditional counterpoint mechanisms. And it's fine. It's good. It's rule-based. But it doesn't talk about the aesthetics. So some of the lines that he creates are, in my opinion, not very good. I talk about aesthetic counterpoint. So we spend a lot of discussion on how do you make a line feel like it lives and dies in one gesture. You don't want it. I call the study of counterpoint a little bit like the first gesture that a painter would do when he or she is setting about to make a painting. Let's say there's a portrait. The first thing would be probably a charcoal line placing the figure on the canvas. That's already a big deal because, I mean, if you have a square and you put a little face on the lower left corner, you're making a 20th or 21st century comment. But exactly where that image would be says a lot about the ultimate finished product of a painting. So likewise, true counterpoint, or the study of true counterpoint, should be none of the layers later, the paint, the colors, the texture of the paint, the varnish, the frame, the museum in which it hangs or the wall in which it hangs, the lighting, all that stuff, is sort of, as I say, concentrically fanning away from the work of art. So when we look at a work of art, we do, wow, it's amazing. But we don't realize that there are many, many, many layers that you're looking at. So when you're listening to Beethoven's Ninth, you're doing, wow, you're in a concert hall, you assume the strings are good and in tune, and the conductor is rehearsed, and the musicians know their notes.
Whole checklist of things that have to go right first, yeah.
Otherwise, you'd ask for your money back. And so I say counterpoint is basically the study of the organic line, the simple charcoal line. No motives, no sequence, no repetitions, one gesture that lives and dies. And how do you make that feel meaningful, beautiful, and so on? And one last thing, because I know I'm long-winded.
No, this is great.
Is my students always, I always ask for a gut reaction when we write a line and we put it against, let's say, a cantus, and so two lines working together. And I show the difference, I put in what I call a boring line or an aimless line, and then usually one note different. And you see the faces, and oh yeah, and they usually all agree. That's what's so amazing, is that we have overall a sense of an agreement of what is elegant, nice, meaningful, pretty, or conversely boring, hovering, pointless, not very interesting. And I think, curiously, of course the bandwidths are, slightly variable, but we tend to all agree on a basic sense of that's a good line, that's not a good line, and one note can make the difference. And for me, that's the study of counterpoint. More briefly, harmony is the study of spacing and doubling.
Okay. Thank you for that very well put description. I really appreciate it. And by the way, I can take this back out of
thank you
from you if you like. So moving on more generally to composition as a whole. I'm just going to put this behind.
Yeah.
If there's anything else that comes up, I can bring it back out. But thank you for doing that. That was very, very helpful. Today in composition, we have the luxury of looking back over, this whole, greater than 1,000-year tradition of music. It's hard to even map exactly when this all started, but the beginning of human civilization and before, when we had just our voices. I'm curious what forces you think shape composition today versus historically. Going back just even a few hundred years, this kind of lead up from music being in a medieval form to Gregorian chant and to Bach or Palestrina to Bach to Haydn, Beethoven. It seems like there is an evolution of what the rules were and what the boundaries were. And sometimes it's a pendulum swinging from a rule that was permitted and now not, and then back to being permitted. And sometimes it was an external force like life events, or, in Bach's case and in Haydn's case, they were writing for either the church or for Haydn was a Kapellmeister and was essentially, not to use the term as a cudgel, but was kind of an employee of the court writing for years when he was starting. And so a lot of the music that was being written, it had a different purpose than, say, someone just writing for the spirit of their own exploration and individuality. But I'm curious, as a composer in 2025 who's had such a rigorous training, but also the freedom to explore your own individuality, how do you view what forces shape composition today and what shapes your own compositions? Because you have a very unique style which touches on Bach and Ravel and it tips the hat to it without, coming across as a copy of some sort. It's authentic on its own, right?
Well, thank you. I hope that I have influence, and I think all composers have influence, something influenced them, but I have a particular voice. So it's hard to nail. I think today's world, sadly, is too much focused on issues of defining a style. So you're in this style or you're in that style, and that's at the expense of voice. I think there are many different voices. Minimalism, Philip Glass has a voice in minimalism, and Steve Reich has a very different voice, and John Adams has a very different voice. They are loosely in minimalism, but those isms are demeaning to the individuality of a composer, and too much energy is wasted on defining these isms rather than to listen to the uniqueness of a particular voice. That being said, I think the composer today is both blessed by freedom, as you said, so the functionality or the purpose of music has evolved and shifted over history. As you said, music was basically a functional thing, either for church or for court or for entertainment, whether it was opera or now film, because for me, film is just modern day opera. that's one thing. And then there's another component to that, which means that composers were blissfully. So I feel that in the early days, up through more or less Beethoven, writing music was writing the music of the day. That was music.
I see.
There was very little recollection of the past. The past has become this giant weight on our back that has progressively come up on us since, let's say, 1880 as a byproduct of recording. We forget the power of the effect of recording on the self-consciousness or the consciousness of a composer. I say Bach was basically a selflessly conscious composer. No self-consciousness. Just writing. Talented, studied, knew a lot of music for sure, but it was really music of the time. He would be fascinated by so-and-so who wrote something, Pachelbel, oh, let me look at it. But that's about it. He didn't really know about Machaut. You might have heard of him, maybe, I'm not even sure. But the amount of past music behind him, from his perspective, was virtually none.
Would you say that's an advantage?
Yes.
Or that was
well,
okay. Yeah.
So he was self-consciously free.
Yeah.
So let's move more rapidly, and we get to the 19th century. I think more or less the people from Bach all the way to the 19th century are more or less in the same camp. They're writing the music of today. They don't really care about the music of the past, a little bit, but not much. They revere it. They don't know very much. And don't forget, they didn't have recordings. So if you didn't play a piece of Bach, you didn't hear the piece of Bach. And then come around Mendelssohn and Brahms and people like that who start revering the past. Okay, that's great. We all love it. And certainly we're byproducts of that because I love Bach. Yeah. So I'm happy to have known him, and I wouldn't have known him if that hadn't been because of this. But the result of that was that all of a sudden the door was open to the past ever increasingly, so that by the time you get to the 20th century, I feel like composers are self-consciously conscious of how self-conscious they are, which is a triple, what would be the word? Handicap in a way to just get to your own care of what you love, because you have so much back there. And your iPhone, there's more on your iPhone that you would possibly able to hear in your lifetime that is available on your phone. So
very well said.
So
yes.
It's and that was never the case. Bach didn't have a phone, nor did Brahms. Yeah. So you can see recording increasingly coming into the actual act of composing. And I think that is the curse, in a way, for young composers today, because they're now, first of all, listening and feeling like there is this 2,000-year repertoire that they at the fingertips, that they're in a way must know somehow. How can you be original like that? How can you even feel like you can add a grain of sand to that already large place? I was blessed because I don't. That's not how I see it. I feel like I learned from these people, and I love what I've learned. But what I'm interested in uniquely in the notes. The notes are my pleasure, my joy. That's my world. So when I compose, I'm a very tactile composer, so I have to hear a sound that grips me. Comes back to what I said very early, that I love a vertical. I love a sound world, cluster, whatever. And then where can that go? What can that do? How can I move it? And the rest of the world disappears for me as a result. I'm lucky, I think, because I just don't care about whether people say, oh, well, you sound like this or you sound like that. Because everybody sounds like something. And the other point, because of recording, everything's been done. So there's nothing new to do. I can slam a door, that's been done. I can put a string quartet in helicopters, that's been done.
It hasn't really.
Stockhausen.
Wow.
I can throw hay into a piano, that's been done.
Yeah.
I can break a piano on my knee, that's been done. Or violin, maybe. That's been done. And I think that if you're trying to find novelty, you're not going to find it.
I see. So we perhaps have exhausted the novelty. I mean, apart from maybe going and playing something in outer space. You know, we've reached the limits of that. Would you say that we have more juice to squeeze in a certain era of music? For instance, I think often about a Prokofiev. I think it was Prokofiev, or maybe it was Stravinsky, who said something to the effect, "There's still a great many pieces to be written in C major."
Yeah.
And there's a book I've recently been reading a bit. It's Bernstein's Infinite Variety of Music, and just seeing the sheer quantity of what is possible. It's some staggering number that is greater than the number of, you know, supposed atoms in the universe. But that said, within the confines or within the structure of these musical boundaries or contrapuntal boundaries, perhaps, following this kind of guideline of musical rules that allow us to write things that are enjoyable and that are pleasing to the ears. What do you think? What is the solution for a young composer who has all of this at their fingertips? Because as a interpreter of music, I see it as a similar problem. You know, I have 500 different versions of the Dvorak Cello Concerto to choose from, and as a result, I try not to listen to the piece anymore, so that I'm not just copying everyone else.
That's a good strategy. I mean, so yeah, as a performer, first of all, there aren't 500 as if those are the reference points. Those are 500 different points of view. Hopefully you'll have your point of view, which will be the 501st. Yeah. And it's only recording that's giving this false image that how can I add something to this great lore of repertoire? But if there hadn't been the recording, then those 500 performances would have disappeared into the history of time. So recording is the first thing to face. Now, for young composers, which is the act of writing, so it's a transmission act, because you, as a performer, are going to play that piece. And therefore, there is that wonderful thing. That's what I keep saying about classical music, that its difference from commercial art, from popular music, from jazz, from folk, is that the act requires another musician, another interpreter. So it's a two-step process to the audience. You don't read a score like you read a book. I mean, some people can, but that's not the point. You go to hear a piece, and you don't hear the piece, you hear the performer doing the piece. So there's that two-step process. Whereas I say when people listen to Let It Be from the Beatles, they're not listening. They're listening to a recording of Let It Be. Nobody wants to hear a cover of Let It Be or another interpretation, or even the Beatles doing it a little slower, perhaps, or bringing out another line. They hear the recording that we know of Let It Be
on one particular day.
On one particular day,
place.
And that is the piece. That's the negative product of recording. So recording, when you bring it to the classical repertoire, is to be fought, I think, and to realize that a composer can only be different by being, number one, true to the voice that he or she is seeking, being sincere about that. And I do think you have to know, because we do live in this self-conscious world of recording, so we can't be blissfully ignorant like Bach was, because he just didn't have access to this. So it wasn't out of lack of talent or lack of desire or work habit. He didn't have it. There was no repertoire. There was no manuscript. You couldn't go to Wikipedia and look it up, or ISMLP. It didn't happen. So if you didn't have the score, you didn't have the score. You didn't have a recording, so the piece didn't exist. So he was blissfully ignorant. Now we don't have that, so we can't go back in time. However, I think composers do have to know at least representative samples of what has been transmitted over time. You don't have to have an encyclopedic knowledge, as I don't think even Beethoven did not have an encyclopedic knowledge of Bach. He knew the Well-Tempered, some of the Preludes and Fugues. But you know what? Just as from my contrapuntal analysis class, I didn't cover all the Preludes and Fugues of the Well-Tempered Clavier, but I covered seminal ones.
And there were representative samples.
The representative sample. Yeah. So a composer, and I say this, hopefully some composers are going to listen to me, I am shocked at how little now students know. So they think they're reinventing the wheel on something that, if you knew this composer, you would realize that that's already been done. So don't try to be novel in ignorance. So you do have to know things.
Yeah.
But then you can't try to imitate or cop or feel like you want to, just like you said, compare 500 versions of the Dvorak Cello Concerto. You want to know the piece. And so a composer has to find his or her voice and be sincere with that voice. But that voice must be edified by at least a representative sample of the past.
I'm curious. It's very interesting. I'm curious if you think there are forces or pressures that young composers have today, or composers such as yourself. I imagine having an established voice and reputation that you don't feel the same kind of pressure that maybe someone who is just getting started might have in their life. But I'm curious what pressures might shape a composer today that are maybe not from the internet or other things, but based off of peers. I mean, I know you take a composer like Shostakovich, who had tremendous pressures in his own right in his life for how to compose, but that was an external pressure.
Political pressure.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you think there are such pressures today.
Oh, yeah.
And what those might be.
I mean, so young composers are faced with a pluralistic society, which I'm all in favor of when it comes to human interaction. Art is a complicated issue, and that's a dangerous territory to be discussing today. But the downside of opening it up to the entirety of infinite possibilities of plurality it creates the inability to make any personal assessment of the value of anything. Because as soon as you say, well, I don't like that, you come across as a right-wing, dictator, autocrat. And that there is truth to plurality. I mean, as I keep saying, as musicians generally are to the left of the left, and I am too, from a social point of view, from a societal point of view. I believe in equality. I believe in equal opportunity. I believe in the ability for everybody to seek happiness and so on, and pursue all these things. And I'm well aware of the sort of inequalities that are inherent in our system. But to then bring that into this pluralistic idea that everything is okay and we cannot make a value judgment, even for ourselves, is not a healthy thing. So again, I come back to the fact that a young composer now is faced with, in fact, a negative force of the pluralistic point of view, because the pluralistic point of view is itself a prison, because you cannot make a statement and say, this is what I feel, which is not negating someone else.
I see.
But this is what I feel. And I fear that they're very afraid that by making any statement, you are immediately putting others in a negative position. And I feel that that's not fair. I would love that there are 1,000 equal voices, but that they're committed to those voices and they believe in them, and that they're not just afraid of walking on eggs or, in fact, breaking eggs.
Interesting. Very interesting. I'm curious, as someone who hasn't had a huge amount of formal composition training, I look back and wish that I had taken the I think it's a multi-hour class on advanced counterpoint. Is that right? But I mean, I look back and think it would be nice, because I'm starting to write some of my own things just, with the cello, and I feel somewhat limited in not having some of that training. What would be the kind of 101 for a composition student who maybe, hasn't had the chance to go to Juilliard, who's starting out, who's maybe on their own? I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and we have a great teachers there, but there's a certain caliber of training that you've had access to, and that many great composers have been disciples of other great composers. I'm curious, where can one start as far as trying to get on the right path for composing better music, or understanding some of these concepts you've been talking about better?
Well, even though it sounds self-serving, I think that the Spiraling Tapestry is a really good premise because it's based on incredibly simple tools. I was very tempted, and I'm still tempted, to write a workbook for it, just FYI, that would actually ask you to do certain things in relation to the rules so that it's not just looking at music, but actually trying to create it according to this. So I think that it gives you a clear view of the things that I think are elegant and beautiful to study and allow you to focus on certain elements and how notes move. Number one, I think that doing species counterpoint is a very relevant thing. So there are good counterpoint books. If you don't have a teacher, the Sulzer-Schachter counterpoint book is a very good book where the rules are not stifling and they still talk about aesthetics to the level that I like, where it's still about trying to make your own judgment of what is a good line, what isn't, and so on. So, and I think counterpoint is a really good place to begin. And then with regard to harmony, keyboard harmony. Playing sequences and cadences. First of all, they're fun. And you set up parameters for, I'm going to go, I have sequence models, sequence cells, and how they duplicate. And I say cell of the fourth, up by seconds, diatonically, going up the circle of fifths every four. And you just do it.
Okay.
And it's a good way to just sense how the notes are clicking along one after another in a logical sequence. And then you add to it. You say, okay, I'm going to put a seventh in the alto, every other chord, and so on. And you can build that way, and you can build a certain expertise in that.
I see.
And then the third component is looking and listening to music, but not just listening to music, looking at the score, circling hanging pitches, noticing how motives, themes that may look completely different are actually made up of the same motivic materials rearranged.
You mentioned at one point to me previously that one of your colleagues or mentors or figures in your life had memorized all Bach 24 preludes and fugues and could dictate them, could play them. How important is a feat like that? Could someone start with the music of Bach and just use that as a reference point for this, or is there a danger in that as well, or a limiting factor?
Nadia Boulanger did require her students to kind of memorize, not just memorize at the piano, the well-tempered clavier, but actually memorize line by line. It's a fascinating feat, and I'm blissfully not able to do that. So it has, I'm sure, its advantages. It gives you a sense that, basically a perfect recall, not instrument based, but just pure notes, because you can literally write them out like you would recite a poem and write it out, in a sense. And I'm sure there's value to that. But curiously, I find that doesn't necessarily provide wisdom. It provides knowledge, but not necessarily wisdom. Contrapuntal voices, hanging voices, understanding when they're used and how they're used and how notes move long distance, that brings you along the road of wisdom. So yes, the story was that I had, again, I never equated myself to the levels of these technique ability of these students of Nadia's. And so I had said to Emil Naumov, who was one of her disciples, I showed him the hanging voices in the well-tempered clavier, and this was my little excitement of just sharing what I had felt in the well-tempered clavier. And he was sitting next to me, and his eyes closed. And he had disappeared for the better part of 20 minutes.
It's like he had searched for all the moments that
then he opened his eyes and he said, I've gone through all 48 preludes and fugues. And you showed me something that I had never noticed. So that's kind of nice.
Well, it's a testament not only to his ability, but to your perspective and how important it was. Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. And it, I, as someone who sat through many solfege classes and felt out of place or behind others, I guess there's a silver lining to maybe ignorance as well, or not having that complete ability. But personally, I'm glad I didn't get that type of training. In other words,
I keep saying that one of the things maybe I'm just overly optimistic and happy, and just happy to be in the world of music that I love. But it's mostly because the door was open for me to see what it was, but I didn't get the crushing knowledge that almost siphons out originality. A composer's ear is something to be protected. It's a very vulnerable thing because you want training, because you want to have the ear be able to hear things in a profound way, but you don't want it so aware that it cannot hear its own voice anymore. And I feel like I just navigated just down that line well enough by luck that I was witnessing the rigor of the sonority study and did it myself, but with a teacher who was much more giving and forgiving and less, let's say, autocratic about how to do it. And likewise, the amount of knowledge was kept so that I didn't have that feeling of being overwhelmed. To me, it's a very tricky thing for a composer. We're talking about a composer where you want to know, but you don't want to crush out your original voice, and that's tough.
Well, I want to ask you about some of your works. You have some really gorgeous works for solo piano. You have a piano concerto as well, and I would love to know if there are any stories behind those, and what the process was like for having them be recorded, and not being the one who's performing, but the composer and the one who started, kind of the prime mover of this idea of a piece and recording it. What is that like? And is it? I imagine it's a daunting task to do that, to get someone to perform your music.
Well, it is, but I mean, I've been lucky also on another side, which is that I've been associating always with really wonderful performers that I just, I could kneel in front of because of what they could do at the piano or at the violin or at the cello. So Simona Dinnerstein is one of my great colleagues and friends, and we know each other for years and years, and so it's a long-standing relationship, which began, by the way, on my 12 Variations on a Bach chorale, which this is the second season that she's doing them and playing them around in her regular recitals, and what a pleasure and an honor. And so as a result, that yielded new pieces where she and I discovered that we both loved Bruegel paintings. We were in Vienna when she was playing the first round of my 12 Variations, and we were in Vienna and we went to the museum, and there were these incredible collection of Bruegels, and we realized that we both loved it. And I said, "Well, I'll write you a Bruegel suite." She said, "Yes, please." Oh, wow. And so I wrote a Bruegel suite, which she's going to record, I think, in next year or the year after.
Wonderful.
And then the piano concerto, where she asked me, she said, I'd like to have you write a piano concerto for me. And that was daunting for sure, mostly because, again, concerto comes with so much baggage as far as you want to, late, let's say 19th century concerto is about showmanship, and that's not my style. I don't like virtuosity for its own sake. I think a lot of my music is very difficult, but it's not intentionally difficult. It's not to show off and so on. So concerto is already fraught from that point of view. And just one story about that, about the daunting quality of writing. So again, it's focused on it's centered on a Bach chorale. Center movement is, in fact, my interpretation of a Bach chorale. The chorale is there and you can hear it, but the orchestra blends in and does my stuff attached to him in a way. And the whole piece is sort of mired or moored, into his chorale. And so I'd written the first movement, I'd written the second movement, everything was going fine. And then the third movement. Well, it's going to be my closed movement, should be fancy, and I got stuck. I wrote 3 or 4 different versions of it.
Really?
And
wow.
They're all in the garbage at this point, never to be seen.
How similar are they to, would you say they were completely different ideas? Okay, wow.
Well, first of all, no, but they're completely different from what we now have. So I was actually in a depression. I mean, it was impossible for me to finish this concerto, and she wanted it because she needed to learn it, and it was slated and for performances, and so I had a pressure, but and I just couldn't do it, and I remember I chucked out these versions, and I was trying various things, and then all of a sudden, so the concerto is called The Circle and the Child. The reason why the circle is because of the following. So I wrote, I would say about 4 minutes of music in one go. Just, it was like automatic writing.
Like stream of consciousness?
Yeah, almost.
Okay.
I had a vision all of a sudden about what I wanted, which was that the piano, which by the way only plays white notes in this particular movement, except for one note, which I'll let the cognoscenti seek that out.
Okay, yes. Go listen to this movement so you can know which note it is.
The piano only plays the white notes, meaning C major-ish. And the idea came to me, this idea of how about a piano that is undeterred no matter what is thrown at it. So the orchestra progressively bashes the piano more and more with all sorts of stuff, but the piano is driven in this Sibyllic march towards the end. And I felt that, first of all, Simona would be the perfect artist for this. She's committed to an incredible sound of Bach, and not just Bach, but I mean this integrity of sound.
And she herself has such a wonderful interpretation of Bach. I mean, we both heard her play the aria of the Goldberg Variations for our dear friend, the late Adam Abeshouse, rest in peace, who we both worked with as a producer, and who she knows well, and.
Right.
But to your point about her interpretation of Bach and the way that she treats, I mean, there's such a care for each note, and there's such a reverence for the music, but also a sincerity.
It's just that, exactly. And thank you for saying that. Sincere, honest. There's no lacquer, no varnish. It's just, as I keep saying, when I hear her play Bach, I'm just hearing Bach. I don't hear it. I mean, of course not. She probably would see this as an insult. I don't hear it as an interpretation. I just hear it as the music. And but I think that's a great compliment.
Yes.
Anyway, so I wrote this first run very quickly. And then for the next 2 months, because I couldn't believe it, it's very simple in quotes. As I always say, it's very difficult to write simple. So it's very simple and straightforward. And for the next almost 3 months, I think, I didn't tell her anything. I played this loop for myself 6 to 8 hours a day. I wanted to make sure that I never got bored with it, that it wasn't simple and boring, but that it was simple and complex in a way, and that it was sophisticated enough to keep my interest no matter how much I heard it.
I see.
And it for me it passed that test, and I used it, and then I built this idea of she's going down this road, and the orchestra's trying to destabilize her, but she ends up, in a way, just walking into the clouds, so to speak. And the orchestra kind of yields and gives in. And it's not virtuosic, but it is, because it's actually 2 circles. She repeats it twice. And it's extremely difficult to cast it that way. So interpretationally, it's virtuosic.
And it's interesting you bring up the circular or the kind of cyclical aspect, because you were talking about that in your treatise as well, in the book, and I'm sure that was intentional.
It is,
and it's something that I want to do a better job of looking out for, and because I mean there are layers to this approach that you've laid out in the Spiraling Tapestry, and that's one of them. But so going back to composition, because I want to hear a little bit about. You have a fascinating family story, which is somewhat similar to my family story. But just kind of final words on composition. How does one who maybe struggles with perfectionism or with writer's block, these are kind of two problems on the beginning and the end, perhaps, of a work. But how do you know when a piece is done? When is a piece finished for you? And do you ever have to force yourself to let go, or can you make peace with each piece? No pun intended.
That's a very difficult question. First of all, I feel my pieces grow even after I've finished them, which is, I think, a fascinating thing. They're like children. So after, it's a little bit like rearing a child. So at some point you do let go. As a father, I know that. You want your child to go out in the world and live and make mistakes and so on, grow. And you can't protect them away from those mistakes. And so is a piece perfect at the end? No. I mean, it never will be. Does it say ultimately what I wanted? Well, I think I approach that. I approach what I'm hoping to have said. Would I ever think like nothing could be corrected? No. But I also resist. I mean, at some point, it's, as I said, it's finished, but it's going to grow. And sometimes something that I might have thought was weak in the hands of another artist, or after having lived, the piece has lived for 2-3 years and has been performed by other people. And then you do, wait. Yeah. So, it's so relative. I thought that wasn't going to work, but actually that does work. And so how can you know that? I mean, when you finish the wallpaper and the paint is still wet when you finish a piece. So you don't really have a perfect 20/20 vision on that thing. And it will shift as it grows and as you grow and as the distance. I mean, I can't tell you, it's very gratifying also to listen to works from like the 12 Variations. I mean, she's been playing, I think I wrote it in, I don't even know, it's so many years ago. And I mean, it's at least a 22-year piece, 22 years old. It's probably a little more than that. And by the way, I wrote it not for her. I wrote it for Bach. I mean, it was my Bach piece.
I see.
It had no commission. It was not for anybody. It was for my love of Bach. That was it. And I had no intention, in a sense, of having anybody play it other than perhaps me. And so that Simona picked it up, and I still remember that day. I handed it to her just sheepishly. I'd finished the score. I was very proud of it. And she was playing as my cello sonata, actually. And I said, we were on the corner of Park Avenue and 93rd Street, I think. And for some reason, I was handing her the score for the cello sonata, and I said, "Oh, and I have written this variation set on a Bach chorale here, And we didn't know each other that well, but she said, "Oh, okay." And 3 or 4 years later, she said, "Philip, I learned your variations. I had no idea." And she said, "I'm playing them on my series."
Wow. So you in those 3 years, there was
nobody played it.
No one playing it. But you also didn't have an inkling that she had learned them, or she just called you up and that. Wow.
No, I didn't. And but I had heard her Goldbergs, and I knew that she loved Bach, and I was. Anyway, I mean, it was a gut feeling that maybe she might appreciate them.
It was meant to be.
By the way, Adam Abeshaus, was the recording engineer for the Berlin concert, which is the CD that has the 12 Variations on a Bach chorale in it, and the Circle and the Child, the concerto was also him. And
but he did both. Okay, I didn't realize that. I know you had worked with him recently, a year or two ago, but I didn't realize that it was those as well.
Right, and he recorded Susanna Phillips and Margot Garrett and Elizabeth Futrell in my vocal CD. Trying to remember there. He also, so Simona recorded a few one-offs. I mean, she did the one part of the Bruegel suite, which she recorded just one movement, and he did that. By the way, I don't know if this will be in your podcast, but I got my royalty checks recently from ASCAP, and it said, your top song. Everything says song now. It's not a song; it's a piece.
Yeah, but top track, top song.
Yeah, top song. And so I click on it, and it was a decent royalty. And I'm doing okay. Somebody must have played piece. That's very interesting. It's the movement that I'm talking about, the winter landscape from the Bruegel Suite. And I'm doing, somebody must have played it. And I'm looking at the pie chart, the way it breaks it down, and it says 100% internet. So it's like, oh, okay. Usually royalties are higher when you have a concert, right? I mean, somebody plays a concert.
But this is streaming.
So it's just streaming.
Wow.
So I dig deeper, and I see it says 1,197,293 streams.
That's amazing.
And I did a double take, and a classical piece does not
incredible.
get 1 million. Although Simona jokingly said, when I told her, she said, "Oh, well, that's not, my Goldbergs have 7 million." It's like,
oh gosh. Well, next to Bach, I mean, come on.
Yeah, but 1 million. I mean, I now know what it is. It's just that it's curated. It's on an Amazon.
It's a
list
playlist
or several
Okay,
lists. So it must be on Alexa, play, I need meditative music, something like that. And that's why, because there are not 1 million people who know me.
Well, and there's a whole, I'm sure there are whole conversations and episodes that I could have on that with people in the industry who I'd love to chat with someone who runs one of those playlists just to know what's going through their head. But it's true that I think a lot of the playlisting, if you get on one, it's kind of like winning the lottery in a way, but your music has to be good enough to, I mean, they're not just going to throw something random up on there. And the fact that it's on a playlist is a testament to the fact that this is what people want. And while it may not be 1 million individual people, it could easily be 100,000 people who enjoyed it 10 times, or
it could be. Well,
200.
That would be nice.
Yeah,
but, I don't want to. Anyway, I don't know.
It's hard to figure out the breakdown.
I just hope that it's not that just because it's on a meditation playlist, for yoga. It could be. Who knows? Yeah. But the point is that it. I will say, and this is to you also, speaking as far as a performer, it's a synergy. So I have the good luck of playing with really wonderful artists, and Simona's one. And I mean, I've had Susanna Phillips. I mean, this is really wonderful. I'm going to be working with Sasha Cook, who's an amazing mezzo, and so on, and Jan Vogler, who I think you know.
Yes.
So I've worked with really wonderful artists, and it's a win-win, because first of all, I never force anybody. I don't want people to play my music because they have to. I usually develop a relationship, and we know each other. We have similar perspectives on what is of value in music, and so we share that. And it's a win-win because so Simona's CDs, I mean, obviously the Goldbergs, that made her fame, but my piano concerto is the concerto on that CD. There's a Ravel concerto, which he plays beautifully. It's fantastic. And Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue, which is, I mean, what a hit. And she plays it really beautifully. But that's where you come up against the fact that there are, 400 other Ravel piano concertos. And so mine is what gets played on the radio. It's that CD. It's always my recording, which I think is really great for her. And it's great for me, obviously.
Yeah.
But.
So looking back at this big arc, or this big timeline of musical history and composition, we've seen kind of rules or guidelines or frameworks being imposed. And one of them is this idea of tonality. I'm curious your thoughts on tonality and how it's evolved and eventually maybe died or was broken or ripped apart. From hearing your explanation about parallel fifths being something that we're sort of steered away from and then brought back by Debussy and others. Things like tritones being, intervals that weren't permitted. Things like even sixths. Things like, in Spain, I think the saraband was banned because it was too risque. Mm-hmm. There are these rules or kind of boxes that have been put around a lot of musical form, but harmony and tonality. And I'm curious, with that evolution from Bach to Beethoven to Brahms to Mahler and Wagner and Debussy, eventually something snapped. And it may have been a historical event that caused that. But I'm curious, what was the reason for that, and why did it linger for so long?
I mean, I feel like, so history did play a role in that. There were historical events. World War I, cut the legs off of the West. World War II cut the head off. And it took those both to kind of really, in a sense, sever the sense that tradition, well, if this is what tradition creates, screw tradition. So that's the historical part that came in that sort of made a cataclysm necessary, even though serialism per se came before World War I. People forget that, but it was beginning. But that's different. So first of all, I do think that atonality and excessive dissonance in music is a byproduct of two things: history and then this other thing. So if you don't mind, I'll say a drug addict, and I'm not a drug addict, but a drug addict needs a bigger and bigger hit, or a bigger, more powerful drug. Yeah. That's one of the downsides of being
more and more coffee.
Yeah, right. Or any, like any particular addiction is cumulative. So if we take that as a metaphor for tonality, tonality established itself in the Renaissance through polyphony. So polyphony centered around triads or tertian sounds, thirds and fifths and sixths, that were consonant, pleasing to the ear. But they weren't tonal in the sense that it wasn't a grammar. So you could have 4 voices, you could have 36 voices, you could have 64 voices. As long as they all worked according to the lines, you could have, 13 E's and 15 C's and 7 G's. And it really, the dosages didn't matter. And that's because it wasn't tonal yet.
I see.
So the Baroque period came in, and the Baroque period established the idea that harmony was essentially 4-voice. That's why Bach chorales are 4-voice, and everything else is essentially boiling down to 4-voice: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And so was born the idea that you take the triad and you have 4-voice, so hence the doubling. And so that led to tonality. And tonality became a language, something that we could discuss and understand, and you could just hear the music and, that just like I'm speaking to you. You're not doing, that's English. Oh, that's English. Oh, that's English. You're listening to me. Yeah. I'm saying things, hopefully it makes sense to you.
It's second nature.
Right. Yeah. It's second nature. So you listen to music, made sense, and so on. So tonality, let's say, was born roughly in the Baroque period. Roughly. People will quibble with me, but anyway, roughly. And then it went to the classical period and the Romantic period. Okay. And we had various things happen, like form was more studied in the classical period, and so it simplified counterpoint. So counterpoint was much lower density in Haydn and Mozart than in Bach, for example, which came before. But then tonality and form led itself back with counterpoint. So you get people like Mendelssohn and Schubert, Beethoven that infuse counterpoint into the harmonic language. So then you get more complex Mozart, basically. Beethoven is Mozart plus more counterpoint, if you want to put it that simply. But then something else came in the late 19th century, or from mid-1850s to the turn of the 20th century, where all of a sudden chromaticism took hold. So we put Schubert as the starter of that, in a way. Schubert a little earlier, but started to realize how beautiful it was to go and take chromatic pitches. And so chromaticism colors tonality. So you can have a 2-chord, which is, let's say in C major, D, F, A, and that sounds normal. And then you can color it and do D flat, F, A flat. A flat and D flat don't exist in C, so they offer color, and that's called the Neapolitan, right? The flat 2, and it has a beautiful sound, a color sound. Actually, literally puts color.
That's distinct from, say, a borrowed chord?
Well, I mean, it is ultimately borrowed.
It is
it's borrowed
okay.
from the modes.
Gotcha.
I mean, because but I don't want to go there.
Okay.
All right. I mean, the flat 2 is a Phrygian 2, so it's borrowed from modes. So nothing is really new, but it's how you package it that sounds new. So in the language of tonality, yes, it was new.
Okay.
Or so to speak, it was coloring the 2 chord.
I see.
So now you have an adjective to an adverb or whatever. You're objectifying an adverb. You're adding more fuel, more color to that word, which was otherwise just a generic word, So chromaticism started to increase as we got through, let's say, from 1830 to the turn of the century. And you get Mahler and Strauss and Wagner. And each one, and that's where the drug addict comes in, each one wants more and more. They want more and more chromatics, go farther, push the language to its utmost level. Oh, look, if I put a sharp 4 and a flat this and a do and I do this, oh my goodness, listen to that chord. And it has such tendency, it's pulling here, it's pulling there. And they did this and they're bending tonality out of shape so that whereas a Mozart or Haydn symphony lasts 20 minutes as a 4-movement thing, a Mahler symphony can last an hour and a half to 2 hours. And you had a smaller orchestra, and now you have an orchestra of 1,000.
The ring cycle is a great example of how far that can go.
Exactly. So the boundaries of tonality just kept going. And I do see it as drug addicts in a way. Yeah. They kept looking for the more and more powerful fix.
I see.
And chromaticism allowed that. So then all of a sudden you could just keep getting high on more and more flats and more sharps and going for distant keys and so on. And so tonality as a language could withhold that. But after a while, just like any human body, if you take too much drugs, eventually it will collapse. And the tree, if I could mix a metaphor here, the tree collapsed around 1900. Okay. Where simply by its own success and by its own weight, the composers had pushed it to its limit.
I see.
And it became, and when I say the limit, it's like, okay, I don't care that I can go from C to F sharp major in 2 chords. It doesn't mean anything because it's already been done. There's no new territory anymore in tonality. Can't go anywhere. It's all been done by Mahler, Wagner, Strauss, and so on. So something needed to change. And this is, I think, a very good perception of what Schoenberg did, and I don't even think that he himself, at least I don't believe so, saw what I'm about to say, but he did it without realizing it. So he designed a concept of serialization. He said, wait a minute, chromaticism is chord tones and non-chord tones, notes that are dissonant that require movement. Well, why don't we turn that on its head and say, no note is more important than another. No note needs to go anywhere. Emancipation of dissonance. A minor second has just as much right to live as a major third. Fine, good, that's nice. It kind of, the gravitational pull is disappearing. It's almost like saying you're in space. Everything is floating around and everything is there. And there's nothing pulling one pitch to another. So that was one concept, and that was as a byproduct of saying, well, wait a minute, if I keep doing these Straussian things, and you can see early Schoenberg, it sounds like late Mahler, it sounds like Strauss. He just quickly realized, well, I just can't go farther here. The drug addict, that's when he said, I got to go cold turkey and find something else. And so he did. And so he did something that was really interesting. And this is what I don't think he saw. So he said, well, wait a minute, not just will I equalize all the pitches, meaning there's no dissonance or consonance, no need to go from one place to another. They're all fine. But then he said, I'm going to arrange all 12 pitches in a row. And those are going to be my compositional material. Now, that was really interesting because that's around 1910 or whenever he starts defining the row, which is circa that. What he did, without realizing it, is everyone else before him had one common denominator, all of them, from the Renaissance to Strauss, Mahler, and Wagner. and that was the scale.
Mm.
The 7-note scale, C major or C minor, the modes, major, minor, had a 7-note scale. And you couldn't break that scale. You could build a whole edifice, and believe me, they did, on that scale, and move pitches and sharps and flats and going left and right, and departing and going to other keys and so on, and just moving to another scale, right? But they were always on the scale.
And so that would be, you would say, the basis of tonality is the scale, the tonic, the search for tonic in a sense.
The search of tonic and the organization of the 7 original pitches. Let's not forget that selfish syllables, they're only 7.
Yeah.
And so you can't get that note between F and G, black note on the keyboard, without saying sharp or flat. It doesn't have a name.
Yeah.
So there aren't 12 pitches. That was arguably Schoenberg's error, is that there aren't 12 pitches. There's 7 pitches, and there are operators, plus, minus, sharp, flat. And that produces an infinite number of pitches, in fact, because you can have a C double sharp, you can have a B double flat, and so on. And so that creates relationship. Well, he didn't want relationship, because relationship is what Mahler and Strauss had reached the limit of.
Yeah.
So what was amazingly modern of his idea was to take the scale down a step and say, I'm going to make the scale my original compositional ideas. Brahms wrote his compositional ideas on the scale. The scale's here, and he's building all these edifices above the scale. But the scale is given. He doesn't change it or challenge it. That's what tonality is. So Schoenberg went one step down and said, well, wait a minute. What about if I make the scale my compositional material and then build up above that?
And when you say the scale, in essence, it's the same pitches in a way, but it's organized in a different way.
Yeah. In other words, you're not saying that C to D to E to F to G to A to B to C is the scale. And then I can flatten, sharpen, make relationships and all sorts of other things, but that's the scale. And that is what was used from the Renaissance up through the 19th century, 1900. So Schoenberg said, no, my scale could be C, F sharp, E flat, A, D flat, B, and so on, and complete all 12. The error is that they're not 12, but that's another story. That's another story. So I'm both saying it's really a brilliant idea, because it's saying I'm going to make my compositional motives the actual material of my original organization. I don't have a preset organization upon which I'm going to build. I'm going to build my organization first, and the order of my pitches is my scale. Again, briefly, the error is there aren't 12 pitches, and that's the mistake. I see. And I mean, I fundamentally believe that that's an error. I remember I went to Milton Babbitt. His office is my office now, and I went to him with this idea. I said, you know what? Why didn't Schoenberg have a notation system that would reflect 12 tone? Since our notation system is a 7-tone system with sharps and flats. So, because it's a little bit like, German encryption of a code you'd want to not other people to read, except that here, if you're writing music, you want people to understand it, and you're trying to encode something in a language that isn't usable for it, because you're trying to do 12 in a 7-note system. I said, well, why didn't he devise one? And believe it or not, according to Milton, he said, well, actually, Schoenberg tried to create a new solfege system that had 12 names.
Oh, wow.
Which, of course, serialists use 0 to 11. So that essentially those are names, like pitch 1 or 0 or 2 or and so on. And so they compose with numbers, so to speak, because that's the only way to relate. Because you can't say F sharp. Because that means it's an F that's sharp. So that's not a pitch. That's not an individual pitch.
So is that, I'm curious, to me it sounds, and this is being partially devil's advocate, but partially just curious and somewhat ignorant. Is that not just a little bit of a semantical argument or semantical approach? You could call it lack, or you could call it any syllable, and it doesn't change the actual the sonority. And so my question, which is the devil's advocate question, is if tonality was, if we were emancipated from tonality compositionally, is it possible to be emancipated from tonality as a person? Can our brains and our ears, can we actually emancipate ourselves from it in terms of how it registers emotionally?
Well,
and maybe
my answer to that, it's multifaceted.
Question,
the answer is no, because it's a little bit like saying, can I create a new language and would you understand it?
I see.
No, look, all the languages, no matter what, they all share one thing in common. Just like I say, the scale was what was common of all styles up until 1900. Mm-hmm. Well, all languages have vowels and consonances. You can't crush that out of the system. Yeah. So you can't make a language with a word P, X, R, T, W. You need a vowel in there because of our human, Yeah. So our voices have to vocalize. So therefore you need vowels and consonances. Because if you just have vowels, right? Yeah. So you need the mix because that's what we can do with our physical bodies. So all languages are a mix of letters, but they have consonants and dissonance. They have vowels and consonances, which is equivalent to my saying we have the original pitches, consonances, let's say, and then we have sharps and flats, vowels. And you put them together and you build a language out of that. So then a more nasty comment on this would be that tonality evolved as a language, much like English and so on. And, I don't believe that there are mathematical reasons for this any more than a language has mathematical reasons for it. It's a codified understanding among human beings that evolve over time for thousands of years, from an original grunt to, this highly, just think of what we are doing. Yeah. I always think it's so wonderful because it is the language instinct. Right?
Tens of thousands of words at our disposal to describe, or maybe no, it's hundreds of thousands. I forget.
Millions.
I'm just talking about English, but
but I meant sentences.
Okay,
there's an infinite number of sentences. All the sentences have not been written, and by using very simple principles of verbs, subjects, adjectives, nouns, and I think music is metaphorically equivalent to that. So there is a tonal music. So there is a language. It isn't just notes. Yeah, and a language is based on vowels and consonants. It started there and then it built up into words and words into syntax and syntax into style and style into genres and things like that. So when you read a sonnet of Shakespeare, you can go all the way down, but you will find a word that has a vowel and two consonances next to it. So you can go up or down the ladder. So likewise, you can go up or down the ladder of Mahler, Wagner, and Strauss, all the way down to, Perrotin or Josquin, let's say. Josquin, who's still writing, more tonalesque music, and you'll find consonants and dissonance, and you can't break that. You just can't break that. I see. So it's so if you do, it's a little bit like saying, well, I'm going to jumble the letters and make an algorithm. And sure enough, there it is. And, and I'll give it to you and I'll ask you if you like the book. It's like, no, I can't read it because I can't understand it because I would need a dictionary. I'd need a syntax or a grammar. Yeah. I'd need to know whether you wrote it pedantically well or pedantically or well. So I'd need a sense of style and all that. Yeah. So arguably, I would say if an atonal work is to work, and I say atonal as opposed to tonal, non-tonal perhaps is better, because atonal sort of says there's no tone, no. But I'm saying non-tonal. It doesn't have a center. You would need to give me for every piece, first of all, how words are made.
I see.
Then a dictionary,
like a new legend, a grammar, a new mapping for each.
Right, a grammar, style, form, genre. I would need everything that I have at my disposal when I read a Shakespeare novel or when I listen to Beethoven's Fifth. I have all of that, So it's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely, So that's why I do feel that I think the chink in my armor, if you want to self-attack, I would say is, well, pitches are pitches, they're sound. words have meaning. I would disagree with that. Pitches have meaning. Pitches have relationship. That's how they create meaning. Otherwise, you could say the same thing. Language has no meaning if you're just listening to the phonemes.
It's beautifully put. Beautifully put. I want to ask you a little bit about your family story. And earlier you made some great analogies to art and to all of the different factors and variables that go into making a work of art what it is, beyond even just the original work of the artist, but also the presentation of it, the framing, the lighting. One example that I can think of in my experience is going to the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia, where, he had a very specific idea about what each piece should go with each other piece, and where in the house or the mansion museum it should be ideally placed. But that analogy is very relevant to your life, and because you have a family history somewhat similar to mine, in that my granddad escaped the Holocaust. He fled Austria many weeks before Kristallnacht, and with several instruments. One of them is the cello I now play on. But your family also fled the Holocaust and were heavily influenced and involved in the art world to a very expert level. And I'd love to hear. I've heard it before a couple times, but would love to hear again. And we'd all love to hear about that story, because it's very emotional and powerful.
So my mother was French. She passed away in 1990. And she came from a family. My grandfather, her father, and his father were in the art world, in the painting world. My mother's father was an art restorer. My mother was an art restorer. The grandfather was also a painter and knew a whole wealth of French painters at the time. They lived in Paris. So they were in the whole world of Modigliani and Soutine and Chagall and blanket Picasso. And that was just the world that they were in. And my grandfather went more towards the restoration world rather than becoming an artist. But, he was always mired in that world. And so they knew it and so on. And he, as a result of the First World War, which he fought in, by the way, as a Frenchman, and of course there was high levels of anti-Semitism even in First World War, and he got punched in the face a few times for being Jewish, even though he was fighting for France like all the Frenchmen. But anyway, so after the First World War, there wasn't enough business in Europe or in France for my grandfather to make a career in restoration. So he came to New York, and he would spend 6 months in New York, 6 months in France. So my mother and her mother, so my grandmother, would stay in France. My mother had a brother. So he passed away long before. So they were basically, the three were in Paris, and my grandfather was in New York, spent 6 months here, 6 months there. In 1939, he was supposed to go to France in September, as he would normally do. But there was the famous 1939 World's Fair in New York. And he had been commissioned by the French government to restore some of the very famous paintings that were going to be exhibited at the French Pavilion at the World's Fair. And so he couldn't come. So he said, for a change, to his wife, why don't you come to New York and visit? You've never come, and bring the children. So my mother was 18, I guess, or maybe even younger, I think 16. At the time, they said, okay, let's go. My mother actually didn't want to go. She didn't like, she was very French. Thought, New York, I don't want to say. But convinced by her mother. And so finally they left Paris on a train to Le Havre, and were going to take a boat from Le Havre to New York. And they had 2 weeks visitor visas for New York as tourists. And they left on August 31, 1939, arrived in Le Havre on September 1, 1939, I believe that was the date, and if it's not exactly that date, it was there shortly thereafter that France declared war on Germany. And so the boat, which was the Normandy, was the last free boat out of France.
Wow.
And my mother tells me the story that they were on the boat, and I believe that that's how I know that it was September 1, 1939, when it was declared war, because they were all taken off the boat. And they said, well, we can't run the boat now because we're in war, with Germany. And then for whatever reason, the captain put everybody back on the boat very rapidly, and they left. And so it was the last free boat. And my mother said that she remembers that her ship collected up a bunch of people who had been blown up by one of the U-boats, German U-boats, of another ship that had passed earlier, and they collected up these survivors in their little boat, in their little rafts and so on. And then, so my mother, by miracle, that Normandy was not attacked and arrived in New York. Her father, by the way, my grandfather, had jaundice because it was radio blackout, because they didn't want to identify where the ship was. So the radio blackout. So he didn't know, number one, if they were on the ship, if the ship had sunk, so he had jaundice when they arrived in New York City.
Wow.
But they arrived. And as I said, they had 2 weeks visitor visas. So my mother and her mother, they had to go, and the brother, they had to go to Canada and establish refugee visas.
I see.
And that's how they did that. And that's how they saved themselves. So actually, they escaped the Holocaust in a way by complete innocence or accident.
Wow.
And I'm here today because of that. Because, I mean, a lot of my mother's family was deported and.
But being the last boat out and almost stopped. I mean, it was almost not the last boat. I mean, it was, in that intermediary of going to another, there was a similar thing that happened to my grandfather, because he couldn't come straight to the U.S. Had to have someone certify the immigration attempt, and it took months and months. And I think he went first to Lithuania and then Latvia, and then took a cargo ship through the Baltic Sea. But landing in Canada. Was there ever a chance that you would have been born in Canada, or was there was a strong urge to get to New York?
Well,
because of the work that he was doing.
The grandfather was living in New York, and he must have had a whatever visa, like work papers, because he was working legally here. Yeah. So he had some kind of residency. Although I don't believe he was an American. I'd have to check that, whether he got a nationality. My mother never got the United States nationality out of, I don't know, pride for France. And as a result, I have French dual national, French and American. And my kids are French and American, thank goodness. And my wife, who is American, Pamela, got French citizenship.
Oh, okay, nice.
Both through me, but it's a harder path. You have to prove that you want to be French. So she's dual national. And so, I mean, the story of art in all of this was, my grandfather knew Modigliani, as I told you, and so he was always in need of money. So Modigliani would borrow money from, not my grandfather, but my grandfather's father, so my great-grandfather.
Okay.
And so he loaned him money in 1909 or whatever, and to pay him back, he painted a portrait of my great-grandfather. Which is, I believe, now in Chicago somewhere in a museum. And then the second time, he loaned money, and he said, okay, I did you, I'll do your son. And so my grandfather, there's also a painting, I think it's in Washington. My family, so my grandfather sold it, unfortunately, in the 50s. But anyway, and then the last one was third time he asked for money, and my Modigliani said, I've done you, I've done your son, I'll do your wife. But unfortunately, this was very bourgeois France, and she did not want to sit because he was making these caryatide style women with deformed, very long necks, deformed noses. And she didn't want to sit for that. She'd say, well, I look terrible. This is all relayed to me by my mother. So as a result, we got a painting which we don't know if, anyway, that's
and this
another,
is the one that was
story.
found in a closet.
Yes,
okay.
Which I found.
You found in a closet. Yeah.
But the wonderful story was that my great grandfather's portrait was left in Paris because it was just at the home where they lived in Paris, and it was in a vault because he had valuable art to restore, so he would keep a vault in the house. There was a place with a very thick, vault style, vault, whatever, for paintings, and of course they were denounced promptly as soon as Paris was occupied. The Germans operated this way. They needed the French to point out people. They wouldn't go and seek them. They wanted the French to denounce the French. So some other Frenchman denounced my family simply because he had an artwork to be restored. He claimed that my grandfather had stolen it. It wasn't stolen. It was in the vault. He couldn't make it to France because there was a war, which is why he wasn't restoring the painting. And so that was the ruse for denouncing the family. So the Germans came, of course, and they put something on the door and says, we're going to come and at such and such a date, and you're supposed to be here or we will take everything. And so the other story, side story of that, which I mentioned to you, which I want people to know because it's a very moving one, was before the war, my mother, like many young girls in Paris, learned the piano. And so she went to a piano school once a week for lessons with a main teacher. But she had a 20-year-old répétitrice, they used to call them, which was just somebody that came to your house and made sure you practiced.
Practice helper.
Practice assistant. She would sit there and say, okay, do your scale, and so on. Mademoiselle Boiseau was her name. I guess when my family left, my mother's mother must have said to her, could you just keep an eye on the house? Since she must have lived in the neighborhood. And so this woman, who was not Jewish, heard about the denouncing, must have seen the thing that they put on the door saying, we're coming on such and such a day. And so on her own, completely unknown to my parents or her parents, this woman with her brother rented an apartment. So my parents lived in Montmartre. My grandparents lived in Montmartre. She found an apartment in Montparnasse, which is in the south side of Paris, and with her brother, after curfew, for 3 nights, moved with a cart and a donkey all the furniture that I have in my house.
Wow.
Including paintings. Wow. And if you come to, have you been to my house?
I haven't.
Okay, well, you have to come.
I'd love to see sometime, yeah.
They're pretty massive things. And she moved a piano. My mother had a Pleyel, grand.
Okay.
My mother gave it to her after the war in gratitude, which I think is a lovely thing to do. Anyway.
Wow. Wow.
So all the furniture that I have, lovely thing. I mean, these a buffet, giant piece. I don't know. I mean, weighs with a marble piece top, weighs a ton. You can't move it. I don't know how the hell they did that, but they did.
A donkey and a cart. And
a donkey and a cart. Yeah. Well, anyway, so it's an amazing story of heroism on that part. And so, but the painting, this famous Modigliani portrait, was in the vault, and she had no access to that vault. So the Germans came, cracked that vault open, took a bunch of valuable paintings that my grandparents had, but left the Modigliani because it was Jewish degenerate art. And it took many years later, but I discovered the Jewish stamp, the Nazi stamp, saying degenerate art with a swastika on it on the back of the painting of my great grandfather.
And you thought to look of that, and what it was. Was it via X-ray or CT? There's some scan, or was it you just had an idea that it was there?
No, I had an idea that it would be there. I said, well, if it was left,
then it must have
been stamped by them, because they would have taken it otherwise.
Yeah.
So they left these things and stamped them as, well, we don't want it as degenerate Jewish art. Wow. And my father said, all right. And I said, well, let's take it down from the wall and just look. Nobody had ever looked. I was there.
You don't have to answer this, but I am at least curious to ask the value of what they stole. If you had to guess, do you think it would have been?
It's hard to know. I mean, my grandmother,
Like, what
my mother
examples were in
said that we had a Titian that they had collected. And again, I stress that in those days, in the, let's say, the turn of the century, that stuff was not worth much. You could buy it for, not much.
I see.
But it started to gain value, and the Germans obviously understood the value of Rubens and Titians and things like that. Yeah. And so they took that, and, so that today's market, that's 40 million.
Wow.
I would think.
This concept of art and music going together, in retrospect, now that I think of it, the spiraling tapestry, you use tapestry it can be a loose term, but it is an art term to a degree. Mm-hmm. How much has art played a role in your musical life?
Huge role, because so when I was little, we go back to what I said at the beginning, when I was 5, my piano was in the living room. My mother, who used to work at my grandfather's studio, but she closed it down when she had her children, so she worked at home. And she worked in the dining room. And the living room has a big archway opening. So I would practice, and I would see my mother at the easel, mixing colors, restoring paintings, and solfeging what I was playing. As I said,
oh, wow.
She had perfect pitch, amazing perfect pitch. And so I was playing, and she would be solfeging back what I was doing. And I was like, how do you know that? And while I was practicing, she would say, so I don't, people think that you make a color by just making a color on the palette, but my father taught me that you build a color. In the old days, the grandmasters didn't make a color, they built it. So they would, if you wanted a green, you would put, an oil paint of blue, and then and you wait 3 months for it to dry, and then you put an oil paint of yellow, and and so on, and different shades. You might put in a little more blue later, and so you build the color. So
it's not just an instantaneous process where you mix.
You don't squeeze it.
Mix two together, and out pops the color you want. You have to develop it almost like a. Film is maybe the wrong comparison, but it takes time for.
It takes time. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about the grandmasters, of the 19th century and before. After that, acrylic paint is different. I mean, you can mix paints, but it's not the same. You mix it on the palette, and that's your color, more or less. You don't build a color, because the beauty of oil paints is they're translucent. So the blue and the yellow blend. You're not covering the blue with the yellow. Whereas acrylic paint, put a blue, if you put a yellow, you're not going to see the blue where you have the yellow. I mean, you'll see some, but not much. Only when they wet mix, it's not the same. So you see, I mean, I actually remember this from my mother.
Yeah, I can tell. I can tell. I mean, I had a couple art history classes, but I mean, actually having the knowledge of the firsthand knowledge of seeing this happen and seeing what the process is like is a whole nother level.
My mother had a secret way of what was called regenerating the varnish, which she had learned from her father. And he had a technique that no one knows. No one knew. And I kind of know what it was because I saw it. And she would regenerate. Most people, when you want to make a varnish new, so to speak, you have to strip it off and put a new one on. And that comes with risks, obviously. And also, there's something nice about the original varnish, which is something that the painter put on, so as opposed to taking it off and putting a new one on. So she would regenerate the varnish, and that was a complex thing. And it had this thing that she would wave in front of it that steamed out a secret concoction, which was probably highly cancerous, in my opinion. But it was a secret mix of things, things like, I guess, turpentine and mix of things.
I see.
But it was the secret mix. She never wrote it down because he never wrote it down. Oh. And so it went to the grave. And I'll never know. I have the thing, but I don't know what goes in it.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. I saw 16th century varnish, which was opaque and kind of grayish, like cataracts on the eyes, grayish, there's filaments in it from humidity and age and dust and dirt and everything. And first she would clean it very, very gently, the whole painting with, again, a secret concoction of soaps and water, very light with, like she had, I remember this pile of 1,000,000 cotton balls that were all black, from the stuff, but she would only do a tiny little corner and throw that one out and put the next one in. Wow. So on, anyway. And then after that, she would regenerate the varnish. And I don't know, it's like spine tingling. You would see the colors come back. And you also knew that it was the varnish that was put on in 1640. So it was basically what you're seeing was what the painter saw. Originally,
when it was fresh.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was very moving to see that.
I could imagine. It's an incredible story, and I know there's a lot more to it, and I hope, to hear more about it in the future. But it's there's so many of such stories, and this one is especially unique just because of the fusion of well, not just because, but in part because of the fusion of different art forms. And you also mentioned to me that something that I'd forgotten, which was that Modigliani's painting The Cellist. I'm curious if you think there was any on his end,
symbol.
If there was any symbolism there, or what his musical.
Well, first of all, the cellist is the only, I believe, I'm not an art historian on that point, but I'm pretty sure that the cellist is the only painting that he ever made that has something other than a person. In other words, he was really a portraitist. He didn't do landscapes. He doesn't do, he didn't do, what's the word? Nature morte. Like a bouquet or whatever. Okay. What's it called? Still life.
Still life.
He didn't do any still lives. He did portraits, basically. And the cellist, I believe, is the only one that actually has something beyond just the person, namely the cello.
Interesting. Well, it's I guess I'm biased.
It's a symbol.
I'm biased in saying it, but it's probably my favorite of his. Yeah, exactly. Well, you've been so great, and so insightful in all of this. One of the things that I want to try to start as a tradition on this show is to ask, rather than me asking you a question, the idea of the show is think music. And you could take your time in thinking of this, but if you might have a question for the audience that they might ponder, it can be open-ended, it can be something we've spoken about, or completely off topic, but something to get people thinking, and maybe something they can respond to in the comments.
I would want to ask an audience member, when one listens, how much of yourself are you willing to suspend in your belief and your personality to actually listen to another human being performing, or in this case, a composer through a performer, sharing his or her love of life ultimately? How much are you willing to suspend of yourself in the judgment that you have about that piece? How much are you willing to disappear? As a composer, I can tell you that I seek to have the audience disappear with me in the world of sound, to follow a voyage which may be what I think, but maybe what you think through your understanding of the notes, and to disappear and break the boundaries between the self, because I think that's the ultimate communion of humanity that we should all be seeking.
Wonderful question. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for coming. It's been a real delight.
Likewise,
to you.
thank you.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.